What is going on, guys? I hope everyone is doing great out there from wherever you're joining us from. Really glad that you're here, and I'm honored that you're here. If by chance this is the first time that you've ever joined us, just know up front that I am a proud moderate, and I served 4 years in the Marine Corps, and every week I do 3 things. I discuss politics, defense news, and looming hotspots around the world that might affect our country. Secondly, I work to unite us and remind us of how lucky we are to live in America, because I do believe our country's division is our greatest threat, and I do try to pull us together. And finally, I always pay tribute to a Medal of Honor recipient at the end of each episode, as well as share some motivation and inspiration, because who doesn't need that, right? Before we get to the news in today's episode, I thought I would start with some feedback from the last episode, and one of the listeners reached out to me, and after hearing the segment about China and Taiwan, the listener reached out to me and said, "Stan, I don't want another World War III. How do we stop this?" and was a little frantic about it. And of course, I do my best every episode to try to downplay what is happening around us in the world. I know the media loves to scare people for eyeballs and attention, but I try to be the exact opposite of that. And so I tried to explain to her that I certainly didn't mean to imply that I'm not even convinced there will be a world war. So I hate that came across. I think there's a potential of it, and I think if we don't act and continue to strengthen our alliances, then we encourage it and we increase the risk of it. But as I explained to her, to me, this is just typical jockeying, realigning, pushing, pulling, probing, the kind of things that countries always do. And I reminded her, a lot of us, you hear a lot of, frankly, belly aching out there about everything. And I think if you looked at our history, if you went back even 100, 200 years, we are so blessed to live in the times that we currently live. And so I certainly don't want to scare anyone out there. You think about people getting drafted into World War II or being drafted into Vietnam, or the incredible racial tensions of the 60s. We live in a great time, despite what some of the folks in the news like to do to try to scare us. We are so fortunate and blessed. Arguably, we're even spoiled. And yet we whine and we act so scared. And so, I try to help us remember that we are very blessed. We live in a great country. We have the capacity to continue to grow it into an even better place to live, or we can take an off-ramp and start down a pretty dangerous, ugly road. But I'm naturally optimistic, but I do believe in the goodness of American people. I try to share that every week. I try to unify our country, and I believe we live in a great time, and that we're very fortunate, and I certainly don't want to scare people into thinking that we're headed toward World War III, but at the same time, we cannot be complacent. And when you see a rising power that is bullying neighbors, and when you understand history and you see what has happened when other countries, such as Germany, such as Japan, when you look at previous times when countries have done these early moves, and they were not discouraged or prevented from doing these types of moves, we know where that ends. And it does end in a much larger, much wider war. And so this is the time where you take small steps to prevent those type of things from happening. This, of course, is just basic deterrence. I know in the Marine Corps, and I believe in the other branches as well, there's a regular saying, which is, if you want peace, prepare for war. And thus, by preparing for war, you're most likely to have peace. I know that even the Russians have a saying that you probe with bayonets. If you find mush, you push. If you find steel, you withdraw. That was a famous saying from Lenin back in the early 1900s, but you can see it in Russia's actions all the time, and you can now see it in the actions of China. You can see it in some other countries' actions that are on much smaller scales, but it's just a pretty common thing in foreign policy that if a country can bully or push a neighbor, it often will. And that is why we're so fortunate to have mostly had peace for so many decades, because as is often put down as the New World Order, but many countries have come together and said, hey, as an alliance, or you could imagine it as like a very large homeowners association, we are not going to allow a few bad neighbors to terrorize the world. We are going to act together and try to control things and have some peace and prosperity, and it's been largely successful. So if by chance in the last episode you listened to that and you came away from it upset or worried, I apologize. That was certainly not my intent. But I do think the worst thing we could do is be complacent or allow China to do some of the things that China clearly wants to do. The next thing I wanted to talk about is it is the 80th anniversary of the big D-Day landing in Normandy during World War II. You've probably seen a little bit of that on the news. And I wanted to share because, one, that is just such a massive and historic part of our history that we should honor, that we should never forget. But I also want to remind folks that part of why we got so drawn into World War II and why we were not prepared for it is that we did our best to be isolationist, and then it took the attack on Pearl Harbor by Japan, and then later, just a very short time later, Germany declared war on us. And so there's a long history of America trying not to be involved in world affairs. The same thing happened in World War I, and then German U-boats kept sinking ships, and it got to the point where we got drawn into that as well. The world is too connected for us to just come back to our shores, so to speak, and ignore the world. It's a lesson that we basically should have learned partly after 9/11, when Al-Qaeda had been hitting us several times in the 90s. We knew the threat was there, but when you don't deal with the threat, it's going to come at you at some point. But back to the larger point about the invasion on D-Day in Normandy. I wanted to share just a couple of things about that. One, some folks on social media were talking about that because of American media movies such as Saving Private Ryan, the very successful TV series Band of Brothers, which was based on a book, that a lot of times Americans think it was just Americans who were involved in that. And one very well-informed person on social media reminded us that of the 156,000 troops that landed, 73,000 were American. There were 61,000 from the United Kingdom. Canada had 21,000. So it's very important to remember this just wasn't an invasion by the United States. We had a lot of partners. And during World War II, obviously Russia, or at the time the Soviet Union, was fighting on the Allied side, and so there were millions of Russians fighting in the war as well. It was a very large joint effort, but it's just, I think, important for us to remember some perspective. It was not just a U.S. invasion. Of the 156,000, 61,000 were from the United Kingdom, 21,000 were from Canada, and 73,000 were from the United States. Let's begin the regular news section by talking about some U.S. news. And since the past week, there has been an update on a story we've been covering for several weeks, and that is in regards to whether Ukraine can use weapons supplied from the United States to hit targets inside Russia. We've been covering how Ukraine has seen some of these artillery pieces inside Russia that are firing into Ukraine. They have seen troop formations. They have seen logistical bases and logistical convoys being pulled together. But these targets were outside Ukraine, and thus Ukraine couldn't hit them with U.S. weapons that had the range to. We've covered at length how the Biden administration had been discussing loosening up what was an earlier restriction that prevented Ukraine from using any weapons from the United States inside Russia. That finally has been provided. The CNN and many other outlets have now reported that President Biden has given permission to Ukraine. They are only allowed to strike inside Russian territory near the border that's close to Kharkiv. As a reminder, that's in the northeast part of Ukraine, and that is in an area where Russia had crossed the border on a new front and advanced south into Ukraine in an area where there had been very little ground fighting. That opened up a new front, and that increased pressure from Russia in a new direction, helped President Biden probably make the decision that many analysts had been encouraging him to make for a good number of months now. There was a quote from some officials in the CNN article that said, "The president recently directed his team to ensure that Ukraine is able to use U.S. supplied weapons for counter-fire purposes in Kharkiv so Ukraine can hit back at Russian forces that are hitting them or preparing to hit them." And the article goes on to say that the loosening of the restrictions marks a break from long-standing policy and comes amid growing international pressure from close U.S. allies. As I think I said probably 2 weeks ago, Europe helped lead the way on this, as France and the United Kingdom told Ukraine that Ukraine could use the weapons from the United Kingdom and from France inside Russia. And so the United States was kind of dragged into this decision, but it is good news for Ukraine for sure, as it will help them defend themselves from attacks that they were struggling to counter effectively. So pretty big news on that front. The second U.S. news story that I wanted to cover was, as you may recall, we've talked some about how the U.S. military has been putting in place a temporary pier in the Mediterranean Sea from which aid to folks who are struggling inside Gaza can flow. Now, the United States and other nations have been airdropping supplies into Gaza, where there is a terrible humanitarian crisis going on with the civilians who are trapped there. But there was not enough capacity through airdrops to do anything more than to make a small dent. So the plan many months ago was for the United States to construct a temporary pier. The U.S. quickly mobilized some forces. Those went by sea to the Mediterranean Sea, off the coast of Israel, and a temporary pier was put in place. Initially, things were going fairly well. Supplies were flowing off of the pier into Gaza. In fact, a total of 1,000 metric tons of aid flowed into Gaza in just about a week, according to the Department of Defense. But following that, a very massive storm came up out of the northern part of Africa, made for rough seas, and this pier is designed to withstand a rough sea up to a state of 2. So rough seas up to a state of 2, and this massive storm out of North Africa came across the Mediterranean and caused sea states up to a sea state of 4, obviously double what this floating pier was designed for, and thus it came apart and also became partially disconnected. So in some ways that was obviously a tragic failure of the pier. The Department of Defense says that the storm was, if you look back historically, you don't typically see storms like that at this time. So they don't expect another storm like that. They are repairing the pier as we speak. It's supposed to be back in place perhaps as early as the end of this week. So that'll be good news for getting aid into Gaza. I will say, and you can't find many articles on this, but you can if you look on social media. But there are additional challenges that the administration doesn't really want to talk about. One of which is that some of the civilians inside Israel don't want this aid to go into Gaza because they are afraid that Hamas will use that to help resupply its fighters. And so they have been preventing some of the convoys. And so you can find video on social media of Israeli settlers attacking some of the aid convoys, stopping them not with direct fire weapons, but basically blocking the convoys and just pulling off the supplies of the trucks and damaging them with mostly unarmed Israeli settlers and civilians doing that. So once this pier gets set back up, I'm sure the United States will need to coordinate with Israel to stop that from happening in future aid convoys. The final U.S. news story that I wanted to cover is the Secretary of Defense for the United States, Lloyd Austin, traveled to the Pacific and did meet with the Defense Minister of China. I've got a link to the news release in the article. There's not... You can tell it was probably a strained meeting because they didn't really announce a whole lot of positive things, even from the press release from the Department of Defense. But as I've said many times on previous podcasts, any type of meeting is usually a good thing, and they both did agree to establish and keep open military-to-military communication at multiple levels, so that's a good thing, but things are definitely a bit strained right now between China and the United States. But I did want to mention, the good news is they did have a meeting, and that is indeed good news. As you guys may recall, a few months ago, it did appear as though there was not going to be much communication between China and the United States following some friction between their president and ours. So it's good to see that they are meeting, but not a lot to report from that meeting. Not a lot of progress, at least. Hey guys, just a quick reminder. If you enjoy the show, you've been listening to it for a while, and you'd like to support what I'm doing, there's a few ways you can do so. You can sign up on my Substack page, support the show at $5 per month. You can also do it through Patreon. I've got a link to that in the episode notes. And then finally, you can even just send a tip through Venmo. I've got a link to that as well. I really appreciate all of your all's support. It helps me justify the time to do this, and I really am excited about where this show might end up going and how many people it might actually end up helping. Your contributions help make sure this eventually happens. Let's move to some news about Russia. This hasn't made a lot of news here in the United States, but Russia is going through a bit of a military purge as Vladimir Putin has now arrested or detained 5 top generals. I've got a link to a story in Politico, and as well as a tweet that somewhat went viral. That's from a BBC editor that talks about this in the episode notes if you want to go look at those. I thought about reading part of the article naming these folks, but none of the names are names that you would recognize. I didn't recognize them. They're pretty senior. They were all like deputy generals, very, very high commanders, but really none of the names ring a bell for me. I don't think the average listener or American is going to know who these folks are. The stated reason is corruption, but again, Vladimir Putin is always worried about a coup attempt of some kind, or people under him getting too powerful. Having said that, there has been a lot of incompetence in the Russian military, so maybe he's trying to make it more professional. No one seems to really know, but it is worth noting that 5 top generals were all arrested and detained, facing all kinds of charges with long sentences, and all of this happened within the last few weeks. So it's certainly worth keeping an eye on. If you look on social media, one of them that was arrested is whispering to some soldiers that have arrested him, but it's clear that the soldiers are very loyal to him. So there's lots of innuendo about if there is some danger of this that Putin is facing because there is loyalty to some of these guys from their troops. There's really no way to know or to speculate on this, but it is interesting that there has been a bit of a purge happening, one of the largest to have happened in a very long time, for sure. The article in Politico, in fact, said that it was the biggest Russian army scandal in years. So, yeah, definitely a big deal. Let's move from that to, I've got 2 more short stories I want to cover about Russia, although the 2 are fairly related. The first is an analyst by the name of Hal Brands has pulled together an article about what he calls Putin's shadow war against Europe is intensifying. And in the beginning of the article, he talks about some Russians who've been arrested in Germany on charges of planning to attack military facilities. Over in the United Kingdom, there are English prosecutors claiming that Russian agents set fire to a warehouse that contained aid or military aid for Ukraine. In Sweden, there's an investigation into Russian-sponsored acts of sabotage. In Czechoslovakia, their government accuses Moscow of sabotaging its railways. There are other plots inside Estonia, which is a small country near Russia that's a member of NATO. In the North Sea, Russian ships are suspected of targeting communication cables and even wind farms. And so with all of this together, including a suspicious fire in Poland, it appears as though, and the Prime Minister of Estonia has said that it appears Russia is waging a shadow war against Europe. And so I've got a link to that article. But I've been noticing some various small bits of inklings of stories for a few weeks here and there, but it is starting to increasingly appear that it's more than just a coincidence or an accident here or just a little suspicious thing here or there. There appears to be some coordination with these stories, and so I suspect that as more facts come out, we'll know more. But I did want to put everyone on the alert, so to speak, that it does appear as though Vladimir Putin is beginning to react to some of the support from the West for Ukraine, and he's trying to pull apart the cooperation and the lockstep that, for the most part, the West has been in after his invasion of Ukraine. That second story that is quite similar, I have a link in the episode notes from a great article in the Washington Post. In fact, I've got the gift link in the episode notes if you want to read the entire thing. But there is an article out that what began as a probe by Czechoslovakia has expanded into Belgium, Germany, the Netherlands, Poland, and France. And that probe has uncovered that there's a media outlet called Voice of Europe that is what is being called an official veneer for a pro-Russian website that favors European politicians that support ending aid to Ukraine. And the allegations are that this website is being used to funnel approximately €1 million a month to, and that's obviously more than $1 million, to dozens of far-right politicians in more than 5 different countries. All of them are being used to allegedly plant Kremlin propaganda in Western media so that they can try to sow division inside Europe and bolster the position of these pro-Russian candidates as some elections approach inside the European Union. So I've got an article on that in the episode notes. As I said, it's a GIF link. You can read it. The main reason I wanted to mention it is, one, it's kind of very similar to the article about the shadow war happening, but also I'm mentioning it because as you watch news in the United States, as you watch some very strongly aligned pro-Russian folks who are American citizens, whether they be in the media, whether they be in government, etc., I just want people to be aware that there are, at a minimum, allegations inside Europe that there are politicians there that are receiving Russian funds. There are allegations that are worth being aware of so that you can be aware here in the United States of what could be attempted at some point inside the United States. I think that's about the only way I can say that safely. Let's move to some Ukraine news. First, I want to start with a story that I meant to get in last week, and this has kind of been growing among analysts, but it's finally made it into some mainstream news articles. But the New York Times had a piece that some U.S. weapon systems are being affected by Russian jamming inside Ukraine. The Russians are blocking GPS and doing some other countermeasures that are starting to affect some U.S. weapons. And the New York Times broke the news following accessing a couple of classified articles from inside Ukraine that somehow the New York Times got a hold of, and it did confirm that some U.S. weapons are being jammed by Russian electronic countermeasures. I want to give a shout out to David down in Texas. He sent that link to me, and he did send a gift link. So if you want to read that article from the New York Times, it's inside the episode notes for you to read. I will say this is another, I guess I would call it, benefit to the United States of the Ukraine war, which is obviously a terrible thing. Russia launched it. It's had so many horrible things, but the only good that has come from it is it has caused the U.S. to ramp up production. In fact, there was a new industry that was opened up just a week ago, or a new manufacturing site that will help produce artillery rounds. The U.S. industrial base is beginning to grow because we've seen the voracious appetite of Ukraine on how much artillery is actually needed should large ground wars happen, or should something potentially happen with China. So we've been ramping up. In addition to that, we've been learning lessons about modern warfare against a near peer rival. And so we've been able to watch Ukraine as it's used drones and other new advances, and also see how some of the weapon systems we've provided, even though they are older, how the Russians have been able to try to counter them or deal with them. So we've been learning some great lessons. That is, there are very few good things that have happened because of this war, but from the U.S. Defense Department standpoint, these are important lessons that could save thousands of American lives should we ever go into a conflict with Russia, or should something happen between us and China. We're getting in very important, almost rehearsals or live simulations that we're able to see and study and that's allowing us to sharpen our spears, so to speak, so that hopefully if your son or daughter is deployed someday down the road, the hard lessons that the Ukrainians are learning are lessons that will help that young son or daughter survive. Again, I'm not trying to make light of this horrific war that is entirely Russia's fault. I want to make all of that very clear, as I try to do every time I bring up the war there. But, as the old saying goes, when life gives you lemons, you have to try to make lemonade. And I'm just saying that the U.S. military, we are learning some important lessons, and we are ramping up our defense capabilities so that it will provide additional deterrence from Russia doing anything foolish, or perhaps from China making a false or wrongly guided move down the road. The next Ukraine story I wanted to cover involves F-16s. We've talked about F-16s. They're I don't even really want to call them an advanced fighter for the United States, but based on what Ukraine and Russia are using currently, they are an advanced fighter jet that Ukraine has been desperately wanting for more than a year. And so, of course, about 6 months or so ago, some training began in the United States and in some European countries. And I just wanted to give a brief update on that. The first U.S.-trained Ukrainian pilots have completed their training. So that's the great news. But Ukraine is frustrated because the United States can only train 12 at a time. Ukraine says it has 30 pilots who are eligible to start training in the U.S. immediately, but there just aren't enough spots for them. There are similar facilities in Denmark and Romania, but they have a limited availability of training spots as well. So Ukraine's a little frustrated because there's going to be up to 60 U.S.-made F-16 fighter jets inside Ukraine this summer, but there aren't enough pilots yet to fly them. So, again, Denmark, Norway, the Netherlands, and Belgium are providing these F-16s, but Ukraine is saying it needs more pilots that are trained, and it needs them faster than what's happening. Now, the U.S. counters that it has these spots inside the United States are not only for American pilots, but other countries as well, including places, in the Middle East like Jordan. There are many U.S. allies around the world that still fly the F-16, and so we have other pilots who are coming here that we're helping train, and so it's just hard to bring in a large infusion of Ukrainian pilots. So that's the issue. The U.S. also says that it does not believe the jets will be a game changer on the battlefield. Ukraine disagrees and believes they would even help in the fighting like up in the northeast that we talked about earlier near Kharkiv. They think the F-16s will prove very valuable, and they will probably aggressively use them in anti-air roles and maybe even ground attack. So Ukraine wants them. Ukraine's frustrated they can't get more pilots trained faster. The U.S. explains we're doing everything we can. So I did want to update you guys on that story as well. I want to move now to a story that had been gaining a little bit of traction on social media the past few weeks, which is there have been some complaints from some Ukrainian troops about the heavy M1 tanks that the U.S. provided to Ukraine. And there's been talk that the German Leopard tanks are better, the UK's Challenger tanks are better, and that even like the more advanced Russian tanks have been performing better than these highly advanced M1 tanks. And I'd seen this story percolating up the past couple of 3 weeks, and I'm not a tanker, I'm just an old infantry guy. But I was a little skeptical of it. But I finally saw an interview that I wanted to share. This is from 4-star General Lieutenant General Mark Hertling, longtime CNN analyst, high-ranking general, was in charge of European forces, longtime tanker for 30 years, and he addressed these comments and concerns perfectly in this short clip that I wanted to play for you guys, because I figured you might as well hear it from an expert. And so here's that clip.
And Mark, I'm going to let them know. Your take is on the CNN reporting this week that the U.S. issued Abrams tanks aren't performing well in the field in Ukraine. There's this discussion about how they were really made for the desert, and obviously Ukraine, not the desert. What do you make of that?
I will say in one word that's hyphenated, that's BS. And I'll just use the initials. These tanks have been basically made for a NATO environment in Europe. I was on these tanks for almost 3 decades in Europe. Didn't have some of the problems that I heard Nick Payton Walsh talk about with that tank crew. They were upset because the tank was broken down. I'll remind folks that I said it was not the best tank to give to Ukraine because there are maintenance challenges and you have to have a highly trained crew to address some of the things. But, some of the indicators they talked about, like condensation on the instruments, that's BS. The fact that Russia knows how to hit these tanks, it didn't have enough armor, that's BS. That they couldn't clear wood lines or they would shoot multiple rounds in a building and it wouldn't explode. I know for a fact, having fired these vehicles and having been a tanker all my life, isn't maintaining their tanks very well. Now, at the same time, I'll say this, Jessica, that whenever you get 2 disgruntled tankers on a tank that's broken down, they're going to give you every reason why it doesn't work and how this piece of crap is something that they shouldn't have. But remember, Ukraine continued to ask for these vehicles, even though they knew that there was a high maintenance standard to keep them running.
One final Ukraine news story that I wanted to get to before we move to some news about China involves, and I haven't seen this in any U.S. outlet, but the Ukrainian newspaper, the Kyiv Post, had an article about how Ukrainian citizens, including citizens, businesses, and even banks, have purchased $25 billion in government bonds since the start of the full-scale war. $25 billion. And I just think that you hear complaints from some in conservative media for sure about corruption or just various derogatory things about some in the part of Ukraine not wanting to serve, some of the male-aged young men who don't want to serve. You just hear complaints sometimes, and I think it's just impressive, not only the determination of all those who have fought and resisted, but also the faith in their government, that people who are worried about, initially especially, even whether they would have a country or whether the currency would stay of any value, would spend that kind of money to buy bonds to keep the government going. It's just incredible. And in fact, there was some information in a report from the Ukrainian government that this $25 billion is the second largest source of financing for the government budget after international aid. Of course, a lot of international countries poured in aid, which was over $42 billion in last year, to help keep the government going, to help keep the pensions going, to help keep the military salaries, etc., to help keep just things running. Obviously, the utilities, so many electrical substations were attacked, but that the people who are worried about whether they'll have a job or a home or much of a future were willing to take their limited resources and pour it back into the government budget. That's just impressive. And back in World War II, I had mentioned D-Day earlier. Buying U.S. bonds were a big deal to help fund the war, to help support the troops. But sometimes I look and I just wonder if something similar happened today, if Americans would be as giving as they were back then. I hope they would, but I know that we are very divided, and I could see how something could become political, and I could see how maybe one side would say, let's just give up, or let's give in, or let's not support this, or let's just seek peace. It's just impressive what the Ukrainian people have done as they've come together to try to defend themselves against a vastly stronger, more, I guess more sophisticated probably is the right word, because initially the Russians had far more sophisticated weapons than the Ukrainians. it was just a one-sided fight, and the Ukrainians have somehow just pulled together and through grit and determination helped fight off the Russians. And it's just an amazing story of how a free people have fought oppression. Alright, so we're going to move to news about China. There's a couple of stories I want to make sure I get into the podcast this week. The first one is that, as I discussed last week, following the election of a new president inside Taiwan, the island that is south of China, China was very upset with some of the remarks made, and so China had some very large-scale military operations happening around Taiwan. 3 different fleets were circling the island, lots of aircraft flying around, and I just wanted to share just a brief note about that has somewhat de-intensified or de-escalated some, so it's not as bad as it was for sure. But interestingly, the United States military said that that the exercises that look like a rehearsal for an invasion, and I'll quote, the Admiral for Indo-Pacific Command said, quote, "We watched it, we took note, we learned from it, and they helped us prepare for the future." And so I thought I'd just mention that. I put a image of that quote that was posted on X or Twitter in the episode notes, because there is a map there that you can see where the different fleets were, how they encircled the island, and it's just kind of funny that the top admiral for the Indo-Pacific Command, Admiral Samuel Paparo, made those comments that we watched it, we took note, we learned from it, and they helped us prepare for the future. So good job, China. Not only did you show the world what jerks you can be sometimes, but you just helped Taiwan and the United States help prepare to prevent any type of invasion of the island from being successful. So congrats on that. Now, the second story I wanted to share, there unfortunately was news inside Hong Kong. As you may have seen in some media outlets, China has convicted some pro-democracy Hong Kong dissidents in Chinese courtrooms, which, whether those are fair trials or not, I'll just kind of let my very long sigh give you that answer in my view. But 45 people were convicted of, quote, subversion charges under the city's national security laws. They all face a maximum sentence of life imprisonment. This is just a way that anytime China gets involved in any country, they start cracking down. Incredible, just the human rights violations, but also the reign of terror, the threats to people not to gather, the clamp down on free speech, the clamp down on free, just the stuff that we take for granted, like media, the criticism of government, all the things that we take for granted in the United States. These things don't happen in China. You just can't Google something. You can't speak out. And so China is clamping down on Hong Kong. It's horrific because Hong Kong used to be a very free and open and thriving place, and increasingly China is doing what China does. So I've got a link to that story in the episode notes if you want to read it, but you can pretty much guess the details of that. It's very sad for these folks who very bravely and courageously did what most of us in the United States would not have the guts to do. I'm sure this will be the first steps toward what will end up being folks who just disappear. That pretty routinely happens inside China. If you speak out against the government, you just disappear. Maybe they beat on you for a bit. Maybe they eventually release you, or maybe your family just never hears from you again, and no one knows whether you're alive or they've put you to death. That's just how things go in oppressive regimes like that. But it was very sad to hear about these 45 very brave people. Their sentence hasn't been decided yet, so I'm sure they'll hold that over their head a bit. There's a chance that often they will put these massive sentences on someone and get them to speak out in a way that maybe is pro-China. So they may speak out against the democracy movement or against the United States or who knows what. But I do fear for the safety of these folks. It is a terrible situation. And it's something that I just think we should remember in America, or if you're listening to this podcast in Europe, and it does stun me when every week I notice there are people listening in Europe, but we should not take for granted the incredible freedoms that we have. They're just, I don't know why we take them for granted, but they are not, it's not that way all across the world. And we have to remember that our forefathers and foremothers, many people died or were tortured or fought very hard to get us to where we are, and we so just callously let these rights slip from our fingers sometimes. It just breaks my heart. Well, we ended on a bit of a darker note than I wanted, but I guess that's just sometimes how the chips fall. But let's get to something a little bit more positive. Let's share a little bit of history, and then let's get into some motivation and encouragement and see if we can't end on a much lighter and brighter note. All right, let's get to the best part of the show. I call this the never ever give up segment, and I call it the never ever give up segment because we must never ever give up as a country. Though we face great division, a massive debt burden, and probably future problems that none of us could even predict, but we must never give up as a country, and I believe we must stay united. And also, as individuals, we must never, ever give up. We've got family and friends counting on us. So in this section, I'm going to share some motivation to help encourage you. I'd like to begin by honoring a Medal of Honor recipient. If you don't know, the Medal of Honor is the highest military decoration you can possibly earn in the military, and it's awarded to service members who have distinguished themselves by acts of valor. The medal is typically awarded by the President of the United States upon the recommendation of the armed services. One final footnote before I read this week's. As I said when I first began this back in April, I am just going in alphabetical order because I could not possibly decide which wars to begin with, which services, etc. And since there's more than 3,000 of these, it was just too much. So I'm just going very simplistic alphabetical order. This week, I want to honor Corporal Frank Anders. Again, the name is Corporal Frank Anders. He served in the U.S. Army, and during the Philippine insurrection, way back in 1899, May 13th, 1899, so more than 100 years ago, Corporal Frank Anders was serving with the U.S. Army, trying to put down an insurrection. And he was advancing forward with 11 other scouts. So he had 12 men advancing forward, waiting for a battalion, which is typically about 1,000 troops. These scouts were advancing forward and came under fire from an enemy position. Now, according to the historical records, there were approximately 300 men in front of them, and there was only one way to advance, and that was forward. I can only assume there were steep ridges that weren't able to be scaled, because typically you would try to flank a position, but according to all historical records, there was only one way forward, and that was to charge or to try to retreat. Corporal Anders and these 11 other scouts charged over a distance of about 150 yards, and in doing so, entered trenches and fighting positions and completely routed about 300 of the enemy who were in line and in position. Again, I've got a couple of links to this that you can see some of the historical record, but just an incredible story. Once they drove the enemy from this enemy position, they entered the town and took refuge in a church tower. It's got, where a church would have a bell, so they entered this church bell tower, and they began to defend it from the enemy, which had been driven out as the enemy reorganized and attempted to attack it. They held the enemy at bay until 2 infantry companies arrived that afternoon to help secure the city. So for these actions, Corporal Frank Anders was awarded the Medal of Honor. Just like nearly every week, I am just in complete awe of the kind of courage these men so often showed. I can't even imagine, but if that doesn't inspire you and give you pause, then I'm not sure what it would take to make you just realize the kind of courage some of our forefathers have shown. It's just mind-boggling. 12 men against about 300 was the estimated total. 12 against 300. One illustration I found showed the Americans with bayonets on their rifles, so they clearly charged and went hand to hand. And you can often read in history where sometimes one side is just willing to die and one side is not so interested in dying. Maybe they only partially support a cause, but I don't know how they drove off 300 people and then held a position from that church bell tower, probably worried about running out of ammo, probably worried about what would happen to them if they were captured by these, at this point, furious Filipino soldiers, but they held it. I don't know what kind of grit and determination and courage and just belief it takes to fight with that kind of tenacity, but I just want to share that so that maybe you can draw some inspiration from it, because I certainly do. Every week when I read these, I draw inspiration from their courage and their fortitude. It's just beyond impressive. As I say every week, I share these Medal of Honor stories to remind us of the sacrifices that have been made through the nearly 250 years of American history. Through so many major wars, more than 1 million Americans have sacrificed their lives and died, getting us to this time and place in our history. In wars such as the American Revolution, the War of 1812, the Civil War, World War I, World War II, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, Desert Shield, Desert Storm, then following September 11th, Operation Enduring Freedom in Afghanistan, Operation Iraqi Freedom, and these were only the major wars that I've listed, and I know I overlooked so many smaller conflicts. In all, more than 41 million Americans have served over the course of our nation's history, and as I said earlier, more than 1 million have died. Tens of millions have been wounded or had their lives shattered. So I think it's always important that we remember these facts, particularly when we have people regularly saying that we face a potential civil war or that we should split up our country because of whatever the latest culture war is, or any other number of silly reasons. I think our grandparents and our great-grandparents and those who came before them would be dumbfounded to think we could rip apart this great nation over such trifling issues. Now, let's share some motivation to make sure that we never, ever give up in our own personal lives. And, of course, if you're a regular listener, I also speak about never giving up when I discuss PTSD at the end of the show. But for now, let's just talk about some motivation, and we've got some great ones this week. Here is the first one. Of course, as you know, we so often think negatively, but this first one is a quote that says, "Change your language to, what if it does work out?" Which, of course, would be a flip of the script on how most of us think, well, if it doesn't work out, blah, blah, blah. But this one says, change your language to what if it does work out? Believe in possibilities. Think of the best case scenario. Retraining your mind will lift you higher out of the overthinking, stress, and worry of negative thoughts. So that's a good one. So change your language to what if it does work out. Here's the next one. Chase your vision, the money will follow. Again, chase your vision, the money will follow. I know many of us sometimes think, well, I want to do this, I want to be a photographer or something, like a painter or something that maybe you worry about how will it, pay off. And just a reminder that sometimes you got to follow your heart, your vision, your dreams, and that will sometimes lead to the money. Don't overthink in the beginning how it's going to pay off. Just start doing it. Or the next one's about training your mind. The quote is, master your mind or it will master you. Again, master your mind or it will master you. This next one's a deep one. You got to think on it for a bit. It's a quote from a management/leadership executive who's written several books. I've read a couple of them. Peter Drucker. The quote is, management is doing things right. Leadership is doing the right things. Again, management is doing things right. Leadership is doing the right things. So, a simple example might be that management would be making sure an employee or a team cleans the bathrooms really well, but maybe instead of cleaning the bathrooms at that moment, there's a big rush, it's noon, you're running a fast food restaurant. Leadership would have been, we should have done that at like 10, and we need all the staff up front so that they can handle the load. So again, management is doing things right, leadership is doing the right things, and in all of our lives, you got to make sure you're actually working on what you should be working on, not just trying to perfect some small thing that maybe isn't even that important in the grand scheme of things. The next one's a quote. Dear past, thank you for all your lessons. Dear future, I am ready. That's pretty good. Just a motivational quote. Dear past, thank you for all your lessons. Dear future, I am ready. Next one is a quote as well. If you keep carrying the bricks of your past, you'll keep building the same house. That's really good. If you keep carrying the bricks of your past, you'll keep building the same house. This next one is a good one, whether you're talking about in your family life or maybe in how you interact with social media or with folks you work with at the office. But the quote is, silence is the best response to a fool. Again, silence is the best response to a fool. I think that's pretty good. It kind of applies to politics as well, doesn't it? It's not like you're going to change someone's opinion. I kind of have this deal where I'll talk politics some on social media, but in day-to-day life, if someone brings it up, I just will not discuss it because it only leads to a widening of the gap in the relationship or some damage to a friendship. Most of the time, people don't really want to hear what you believe. They just want you to agree with what they believe. And there's really just no point in fracturing that relationship. So I don't discuss politics in person. And so silence is a good tool to have in your toolbox. Again, the quote is, silence is the best response to a fool. And then we got one more good quote. The quote is, your growth is a continuous process. Again, your growth is a continuous process. I think all of us can get a little frustrated by the lack of progress sometimes in the beginning. Feels like you're not making any headway. It's just a reminder that your growth is a continuous process. The things that are hard for you to do now, it's like weightlifting. It's going to be easier to bench 135 pounds after you've been lifting for 6 months than when you first begin. You just got to stick with it. And you got to remind yourself of the improvement and the gains that you're making. I try to do that with my podcast. Sometimes it's easy for me to get frustrated. There's so many podcasts out there. But I go back and listen to an episode from 6 months or a year ago, and they're just horrendous. And so I know I'm making progress, and I know that the numbers that sometimes aren't as high as I wish they were right now are way higher than they were 6 months ago. I should be happy with them. Just got to understand it's a process and that your growth is continuous. I always like to share a few from the Bible because this book has become such a source of strength and wisdom and calm for me during the past year. And I hope by sharing a few verses, it might help encourage you to get into the Bible yourself because I think it will really help you. And honestly, if you were like me and you'd spent years and years reading self-help books, meditating, Buddhism, whatever it was that you've been doing, and it's still not working, then I say why not try something else? We know that the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over, expecting a different result. So if you've never cracked open the Bible, I invite you to try it. In fact, I almost double dog dare you to try it. Because if it's all fake, if it's all not real, then it should have absolutely no effect on you. If it's just another lame self-help book, then you have nothing to worry about. You've tried everything else, so why not try this? And I think if you do, you'll see that the Bible is the handbook for your life. I think you'll find it speaking to you because it's not just ancient words, it's the wisdom of God. And if you need hope and purpose, if you're really drowning and feeling lost, then you need more than the self-help quotes I shared above. You need God. And one of the best ways to find Him is in the Bible. You don't have to go to some church you're nervous to visit. You can start learning about Him from the safety of your home by simply reading the Bible, either in print or on your phone through a Bible app. The first one this week comes from the book of Psalms, chapter 139, beginning with verse 17. How precious are your thoughts about me, O God! They cannot be numbered. I can't even count them. They outnumber the grains of sand. And when I wake up, you are still with me. The next one is from Psalms chapter 42. As the deer longs for streams of water, so I long for you, O God. I thirst for God, the living God. Where can I go and stand before Him? Then we're going to knock out a couple from the book of Proverbs. The first one is from chapter 1, verse 7 and 8. Fear of the Lord is the foundation of true knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and discipline. My child, listen when your father corrects you. Don't neglect your mother's instruction. And then we're going to do one more from Proverbs. This one's also from chapter 1, verses 32 and 33. For simpletons turn away from me to death. Fools are destroyed by their own complacency, but all who listen to me will live in peace, untroubled by fear of harm. Thanks so much for joining us this week. I hope as you go through this week that you act a little nicer on social media and in the world as well. Smile at folks in the grocery store, do small acts of kindness, and remember that most Americans are good, and they will help you in an emergency, even if you don't agree politically. Now, I have to finish with two things. I want to say a bit about myself and my books in case you're new to the show, and then I need to say some words for those struggling with PTSD or mental illness, especially since veterans are at a 57% higher risk of suicide. First, a bit about myself and my books. I am a military vet. I spent 4 years in the Marine Corps, all of that time in the infantry, and yes, that does matter. After my enlistment, I went to college at the University of Tennessee. I became a journalist. I spent more than 10 years in the news business. Besides all of that, I've also written 12 books. Those books include a series about a Marine Corps sniper, several novels about a police detective and a private investigator, and a few books about war, such as World War II and Afghanistan. Basically, these are all fast-moving books with lots of action and plot twists, because those are the kind of books I've always enjoyed reading. You can find all of those books in the link in the episode notes, or you can look on Amazon by just searching my name, Stan R. Mitchell. Buying a book, telling a friend about a book, or buying one as a gift for someone, friend or loved one, is a great way to help support the show. And in all seriousness, they're pretty highly rated, and I've been very fortunate to have sold 70,000 copies to date. And I promise you, even though I live in Tennessee, I do not have that many cousins. The second thing I need to talk about is PTSD and suicide for just a moment. This isn't just for our veterans, although I know PTSD does seem to affect veterans at a much higher rate, but it's for anyone. We can all get in a really low spot But we have to remember that it's a season. It's a valley. If you're having serious issues, please call 988, select 1. You can talk to a crisis line responder anytime, day or night. Whether you're a civilian or a veteran, it doesn't matter. But I do know this is hard to do, and I know most of you won't, so I have to be a little mean here. The fact is that when we had a drill instructor in boot camp pushing us, or maybe a tough coach back in high school, you know that you can go further than when it's just yourself pushing you. So I'm going to be that person. I'm going to be mean for just a moment, and I have to remind you that you cannot give up. Do not lose this fight. Do not make your parents or your family have to plan your funeral. Don't make them feel guilty that they did not check on you, that they could not reach you. You can hold on another day, and if you do, I promise the next day will be a little easier. Now, again, if you're in a fight that you worry you may lose, call someone. Call a friend or a family member. Please, just do that. Or call 988, select 1. But whatever you do, do not quit. You're in a valley, and this world needs you. Probably your parents need you. I mean, seriously. Who's going to take care of your parents in 30 years? I'm being dead serious here. I just helped take care of my mom while she fought with cancer before she passed. I'm helping take care of my dad now. But who's going to do it for you? Are you going to let the system take care of them? How horrible is that? So you cannot quit. And believe me, there's something you're meant to do. You just can't see it because you're in this immediate fog and pain. You can't see that end result. But there's a mission for you to do. Maybe it's to coach Little League. Maybe it's to help others with PTSD. Maybe it's to run for office. But there's some calling for you. You just haven't found it. But you need to get involved. You need to stop isolating yourself. Go visit a veterans group, the VFW. Visit a church near you. Talk to some family that you have lost touch with. Or maybe reach out to that friend that you've grown apart from. They're probably dying to talk to you. But seriously, if you're struggling, call the hotline 988 and select 1. Or you can also start moving toward God. If you're not willing to make that phone call, read the Bible if you never have. I think it will help. Read some of Psalms or Proverbs, or start with the New Testament. I would suggest the book of John. I think you'll find that the Bible will start drawing you in and changing your life. If you don't have a Bible, you can download a Bible app on your phone, or you can look it up online. There are dozens of sites with it. Even simpler, I have a link in the episode notes that I think can help you. I write a faith-based blog about the Bible and God, and I have a link in my episode notes to a pretty powerful story about my dog, who is a stray that we adopted from the shelter. The title of the article is Be Like Ozzy, Go Near Your Master. I've had a lot of people tell me that story really helped move them, that it was very impactful. So, it's free to read. You got nothing to lose by going to read it. Now, I always like to end each show by reminding people that you can comment anytime. I try to monitor those. You can also reach out privately by email to me at authorstanrmitchell@yahoo.com. And that's in the episode notes, by the way. But again, it's authorstanrmitchell@yahoo.com. Hey, here's one other thing. This podcast is about defense news, but I also do a political blog. So if you love my moderate, optimistic views, you might enjoy that. It's called Thoughts from a Southern Gentleman. You can find a link to the episode notes to that as well, or you can just search that on Google. Hey, thanks for hanging with me this week. It's truly an honor to talk with each of you and to know that there's a few of you out there who are listening and who care about our country and our military and all the issues that we face. I know there are a lot of scary issues out there, but we're going to get through them together, the same way America's gotten through everything before this. I love you all, but never forget that God loves you more than you can possibly imagine. He is our true Father, so I hope you spend some time with Him this week. If you want true peace and strength and wisdom, make sure you read your Bible some this week. It'll help you a lot. And also, reach out to a friend or anyone who you know is struggling. Whether they are young or old, life is truly hard. We know this. But the true strength of this country is its people, and that includes you folks listening to me right now. So be a leader, be a doer, be a servant to someone. With all of that being said, I'll catch you all next week. You have been listening to The View from the Front. I hope you enjoyed the show. This is the bonus portion of the show, and if you're listening to this, then you are certainly someone who enjoys listening to the podcast. you're probably a supporter, and I am truly honored that you are listening to this part of the show, because you have gutted it out and hung in there. I want to just say just a short intro. The part you're about to hear is the prayer that I prayed before taping this week's episode. You will probably notice that my voice is a little lower, and it's certainly less confident. It is not nearly as certain in the words that I use. I do not write any of it down. All I have done is taken out some of the pauses, because when I prayed this prayer, in some cases those pauses were 10 to 15 to 20 seconds, because I was trying to communicate with God. I did not know what I was going to say. I was trying to be as real and as open and genuine as I possibly can be. I'm inserting this intro just because I know some will say I should not post a prayer that Jesus, even in the Bible, puts in some words against public prayer. But I will say it's a more complex picture than that. He being Jesus, prays publicly in a couple of different places in Matthew, also in Mark, also in Luke. He also taught others to pray publicly. That's in Matthew. The early church prayed publicly. Jesus' apostles prayed publicly. You can find that in Acts chapter 27, verse 35. They also even wrote down prayers for others to read. You can find an example in Ephesians chapter 3, beginning at verse 14. I could cite many more examples, but the reality is that people pray before sporting events, before many government meetings, and I could just keep that list going. And at least this week I felt led to do this, and so I'm going to do this because I know that, at least speaking for myself, I have heard prayers that moved me, and so I will share what I prayed. And you've been forewarned what I'm going to do, so if this is something that would bother you or offend you, you've had plenty of chances to go ahead and move on to the next podcast. So here is what I prayed prior to this episode. Lord, thank you so much for this day. Thank you for all the blessings that we take for granted. The roof over our heads, the health, even the air we breathe. Help me with today's show to once again try to do your will, to provide a voice of calm and stability. Help me do my small part to help bring the country together, to help inspire or touch someone out there. And if anyone is struggling with mental illness or PTSD or trying to find a way forward, I hope that this will touch them in some small way. We ask these things in your name. Amen.